From my vantage point, I tried to look closer, and those were headlights for sure. They were pretty far off and heading in my direction, but the glare from those lights made it a little difficult to see what type of vehicles they were. Looking at the road, I realized that they would have to pass right by me if they wanted to reach the next intersection. Would have grinned at the idea if they didn't slow down to take a hard left turn into the apartment complex down the street. As I started coming down the tree, I could see searchlights begin to light up as they started searching the area. Being a bit curious, I took several minutes for me to reach the other complex. From the outside, it looked pretty much intact. Once I got over the fence, it was a totally different story. Most of the windows and doors had been ripped out or knocked out. A few areas had bloodstains, like the doorways, sidewalks, and of course the occasional vehicle. Moving around, I could hear whoever it was talking as they began to clear each building. Men cursing at the remains of the former residents. The kicking in of doors or the breaking of glass as they tried to gain entry. It was an interesting view to watch as they systematically went door to door searching. It became pretty clear that they were not just looking for people. As they came out of each house, they had bags of canned food or some other type of way to preserve food. One would shout out in glee how he would found a bunch of steaks in a freezer, while another one would say how he hoped that they were still good. I was about to raid them when I saw something very good. I could hear yelling from another row of apartments, so I crawled over to investigate. I got there just in time to see them ushering a man and 3 children ranging in ages from early teens to young enough to have to be carried as they rushed them to the vehicles. Also, getting a good look at the vehicles, I realized that they were up-armored Humvees. Pretty heavy-duty stuff for this area. The men in the turrets were smart enough to keep their weapons pointed out, but not smart enough to look up. I noticed them as the first child was placed inside. They circled and seemed to be analyzing the situation, making a plan for their assault. Even with my great night vision, I was hard-pressed to make out more than just blobs and strange shapes in the night sky. I kept my eyes on them for at least a minute before one of them made a move. I wanted to yell. I wanted to jump out and protect them. I wanted to stop these creatures before they made their run, but I had to wait. I'm not human anymore, and they would take me out just as fast. The first one swooped in and grabbed a soldier. This bat-like creature sunk its talons into the shoulders and chest of the man as he attempted to pick him up. It would have succeeded if one of the others had not been so quick on the trigger. The rapid amount of shots rang out into the night. He must have emptied half of the magazine before even looking to see what even hit. The creature buckled under the impacts and staggered its movements as it tumbled to the ground. This part woman, part bat thing was on the ground convulsing in pain as another scream entered the night air. Somewhere, I couldn't see, was being taken as well. In that moment, at least a dozen of these bat things came diving out of the sky. Most pretty much picked up their prey like a raptor, sinking their talons into the chest and backs in order to kill the men in a few seconds. With that, they would take the men away to be consumed in another location. At first, I was going to let the situation play out and then take the spoils later. Just by looking at most of these bat things, I could tell that at least half of them had changed so that their arms had turned into bat wings, from the bottom of their feet changing into talons of some sort. Others had wings that came out of their backs, allowing them to have human arms to strike with. Hell, one even carried a firearm. He landed and actually thought he could face the soldiers like a video game protagonist. Landing in the middle of the parking lot, he began to engage the soldiers, taking down at least 2 of them before a turret gunner spun around and perforated him. When he did so, the batty guy fired at the Humvee, hitting the turret shield and the engine block. The children inside screamed, and I could not remain in my hiding spot any longer. While the turret gunner reloaded, I could see another diving in. It was about to land on him with enough force to crush his torso. Sprinting on all fours, I drove at the vehicle at full speed towards the waiting up-armored Humvee. The teenager screamed in terror as he saw me coming. He pulled away from the window and covered his head as I used the power of my legs to pounce as high as I could, colliding with the diving bat less than a second before he hit the gunner. I'm sure he was confused at the amount of movement around him, but I had other things to worry about than a gunner's confusion. This bat thing still had its human's arms and tried to keep a good hold on its knives when I hit it. I hit it in the back and it folded the wrong way with the force of the impact. It seemed to try and stab me with one knife it was still holding on to, at least until he made contact with the ground. The amount of speed I had picked up continued as we hit the ground. With my weight on top, I used his body as a sled as the asphalt ripped its chest and face to pieces. The blood trail stretched over 10 feet before we came to a stop. I picked up its head and I let it out a cry of pain and rage before I smashed its head into the ground. Again and again I did until I felt the skull collapse from its front. As I stood up and looked around, I could hear something. The sound of a machine gun being chambered. I turned and saw that the gunner was aiming it at me, so I dove under the Humvee. I could hear him cursing as he couldn't hit me. Something else had gotten into his attention, though, because a few seconds later I could hear the gun cycling through bursts of fire. I took this opportunity to save another that was being taken. The bat had one of the soldiers by the legs and was attempting to fly away with him thrashing around. Using all four again, I darted towards the building between us. Jumping up to the awning, I used it as a platform to jump up onto the roof. From there, I ran to catch the bat. Jumping off, I almost landed on it as I fell, as strong impact pushed me forward. Apparently, someone tried to shoot me, though I didn't have time to worry about it now. Landing on the bat's back, I grabbed its neck, extended my claws, and ripped as deep as I could. The blood sprayed out in multiple directions as the arteries were severed. Now, I didn't know if he dropped the first guy or lost consciousness first. All I know is that we were all headed for the ground, and fast. We all tumbled to the surface and crashed hard into the ground, rolling to a stop. I jumped up and made sure the bat wasn't still kicking before turning my attention to the soldier on the ground. The soldier was clearly in pain from the fall, but still awake and alive. I approached him, and he tried to backpedal, but the pain in his body seemed to couple with the deep lacerations in his leg. This stopped him. He started screaming for me to get back and even pulled his pistol. 4 shots to the chest, and I tumbled backwards and fell to the ground. Instantly, I rolled over and darted into the road line. Coming back around, I looked at him, and he was clearly scared out of his mind, turning and pointing the pistol at any perceived noise. I could see blood starting to cover his legs as the adrenaline kept him on high alert. When he turned away, I darted out and grabbed his arm, slamming it into the ground, and looked into his eyes. With sheer terror, he looked back at my reptilian form. I held a finger to his mouth and tried to tell him to be quiet. He seemed to calm down a little bit, at least for the moment. I was able to get the pistol out of his hand and set it to the side. Then I reached into his individual first aid kit and opened it up. He looked on in astonishment as I pulled the tourniquet out and put it on his leg where the worst bleeding was. He cried out in pain as I tightened it, but I didn't stop until the bright red bleeding had stopped. Then I grabbed a pressure bandage along with the quick clot he was carrying and took care of the other leg. He was a little freaked out when I had to rip his pants open, even more to take care of him. But he eventually looked at me and said, "I shot you." I looked at him, raised my chest so he could see the insectoid plates, tapped my hand against them and responded, "Armor." By this point, I didn't know if he had calmed down or the lack of blood made it difficult for him to think. Either way, he wasn't giving me any problems anymore. Before picking him up, I drew a T on his forehead with his blood. Or maybe it was the bat's blood, I don't know. Regardless, I handed him back his pistol and picked him up. As I brought him around to the other side of the building, I could see that the convoy was finishing up loading their remaining people. As we stepped out, I said to the young man that was in my arms, "Call to them." He looked at me and then turned. With all his strength he could muster, he called out to them. Only one looked our way. The look of shock on that kid's face was a mix of shock, horror, confusion, and relief as the injured one waved at him. The one that noticed us yelled to the others, and I'll admit my heart skipped a beat when almost all the weapons suddenly pointed at me. Thankfully, the injured one was able to keep them from forcibly removing my brain at 1,500 feet per second. Slowly, I walked over, and the injuries became apparent, and he yells for the medics went out. I reached the group and laid the injured man on the ground, and soon as I let go, their leader shoved a weapon into my chest and asked, "Give me a good reason I shouldn't kill you, monster." I didn't know why, but the last part stung a bit. "You mean besides saving your man?" I answered. He looked at me in shock, just like all the others. "How about saving a truck full of civilians? Does that count?" As I motioned to the Humvee full of kids, still looking at me and almost pissing themselves in fear. He paused for much longer than I would have hoped before lowering the muzzle of his weapon. "All right," he said. "What do you want?" I thought about it for a second before responding. "Got any explosives?" I asked. They looked confused at the question, so I added, "There's something very large I have to kill. Before it kills me, of course." They talked about it amongst themselves for a moment before opening the back and handing me a handful of grenades. I reached and grabbed a couple of claymore mines and stuffed them into my makeshift haversack. It was about that time I heard something that, if I had any hair left, it would have been standing on end. I heard, and I turned to the one in charge and said, "You have to go now." He listened and heard the same noises. Then he asked what was making those noises. I simply responded with, "Scavengers, and lots of them." I hurried to the closest bat-ish bodies and then threw them over my shoulder. Without hesitation, I darted into the night. I know the blood trail was fresh, but I hoped I could make enough distance before they gave chase. As I was running, I could see the headlights sweeping across the area, meaning the convoy was making their turn and heading out. I would have smiled if I could. Once back to my lair, I began prepping the newly acquired food. I had to laugh as one of the bodies was still clutching a rifle that it had tried to shoot the soldiers with. My hands are now far too big for me to use it right, but it didn't stop me from being amused by the whole situation. The kicker of that creature was that it had been pre-tenderized with all the high-caliber bullets that had torn most of it apart. Though it hadn't been much action, I was still rather hungry. So, of course, the organs went down before I was able to cook anything. I was a little pissed that the liver, my favorite part, had taken a direct hit and just been blown apart to tiny little pieces. In fact, more than half of the organs were in pieces and the gut cavity had been ruptured. Guess this one will have to be turned into jerky if I want to eat it and not risk getting sicker in hell. Food is difficult enough to find as is if it wasn't for the fact it was far worse with several cases of the shits. Don't need that in a survival situation. While I thoroughly cooked it, I placed a few large pots next to the fire. These were not for the food, but instead for water. I remembered how my old instructor used to say, "The number one reason for people to die in a disaster scenario is poor sanitation," or something like that. I figured it wasn't worth risking since I already had the fire. When it came to cutting up the human-looking pieces, I will admit I hesitated a little. The thought of eating human is enough to turn the stomach of even the most hardcore people on this planet. But, like I said before, food was getting very difficult to come by. Most of it was intact, and I placed the bones, cracked open of course, and poured the marrow into the pots to make a broth. Nothing was going to go to waste here, not if I could help it, that is. Though, what do you do with the wings? The wings were tough, but the insect armor was enough for me. My hide was able to stop blades, so this wouldn't add to my protection, so what do I do with them? Eventually, after pondering, I just said, fuck it, and I started eating them. A bit tough, even for my enhanced jaws, and they didn't taste all that well. However, it was not the time to be picky. I tried to eat the skin of this thing, but the hair, oh, yuck. I'm going to crack open the brains and eat those too. But as I got to the back of the head open, I realized that the impact from the bullets made it rancid. Standing there with the piece of scalp, there was when I tasted the skin. I choked the piece down and found it difficult to even try to take another piece. I know I don't want to waste anything, but a man has limits. Oh, I shiver in disgust even thinking about what that one piece was doing in my digestive tract. While that one cooked, I moved on to the other one, and when I finally stopped to think about it, why so many of them? I was taking a moment to think and wondered how they all got together like that. It was a coordinated attack and clearly defined leadership. The alpha of the group was currently my dinner cooking over the fire, but what about the others? The fire popped and I realized that I still had work to do. When I started to process the next one, I found that the knives I had been used had gone dull. Even with my strength, I was finding it difficult to use them. I was about to go and get some more when I remembered that I already have 2 really good blades on me. I drew the insect swords and went to work. It was simply amazing how well they worked. I was able to process out this other batty thing in half the time and enjoyed the organs while I waited. This time, there was a nice big liver and heart for me to savor, with kidneys on the side. Ooh, the rich flavor of each tear of the flesh. Each time it burst with flavor as the smell from the fresh catch permeated my nose. Eventually, I started taking parts from the wings and making a kind of pigs in a blanket. The mix of flavors and textures made it quite the satisfying meal. It will take life's little bonuses where I can get them, of course. Chowing down on freshly cooked tenderloin, at least I think that's what those big slices were, I finished up and got ready to go to sleep. I had fresh, clean water to drink and plenty of food to last me for at least a week. Life can be good sometimes. Besides, I've got my eye on a much bigger prize right now, though that will have to wait till tomorrow. I could feel the sleep begin to work its way in again. I'm starting to wonder if I'm going to go in some sort of food coma every time I eat like this. I wonder. I have to fight it until I get everything locked up. I'm not the only one out here after all. I remove my armor and take a good look at the chest plate. The bullets did ricochet, leaving only a hairline crack to deal with. I take the rest of it off and move around, stretching a bit before bedding down. Once everything is secured, I curl up and enjoy having a very full stomach. Tomorrow, well, tomorrow's going to be interesting. I wake up and it has to be noon at least. Holy crap, how long was I out for? I felt stiff as I stretched out, and I could feel my joints pop as I reached around. I even stretched out my tail, so much so that it reached the far wall. That's when I felt something else. Something on my back, but it was not on my back. What the? It was sort of on my sides, were touching me on the sides, and also touching the sides of the room. But that can't be right, could it? I turned to see something I was not prepared for. I whipped my head around to the other side to make sure I wasn't losing my damn mind. How in the hell did I grow wings? I'm not kidding. They were stretched out from one side of the room to the other, and they were not even fully extended. I lifted my arms to see if they were parts of my arms, but nope. Oh, thank God. At least these were fully separate appendages. It would suck if they were part of my arms. As the reality of it all swept over me, I felt lightheaded and dropped to my knees. What was I going to do? Do I change every time I sleep? I'm sure it seems this way. Great. So, to make sure I don't change again, do I have to stay awake forever? Though, for now, I can't think about it. I've really got to get something to eat. Making my way down the stairs was a new challenge. The wings made it difficult to get my perception and of how and where, if I could even walk with these things on. Eventually, I said, fuck it. I went on all fours in order to move around. My body seemed to gain some mass, too, or maybe it was just my perception of these things with the new wings. Whatever the case, it was time to get something in my system. Thankfully, I hadn't sleptwalked into the kitchen again. There was plenty of food and water waiting for me, and it was time to dig in. I found it difficult to ration my food, but not impossible. The old trick of drinking a lot of water to help satiate the hunger was helping a lot, though it didn't help for very long. It seems as though every time I change, I burn through a ton of calories. Makes sense, since my body would have to reconstitute a ton of mass to make this kind of change possible. While eating, a thought entered my mind. How could this much change happen in one night? The more I thought about it, the more I realized it couldn't. This would explain why my food tasted so dry. I mean, I know it was smoked and dried, but even then, it should taste fresher than this. When I was done eating, I went and found my cell phone. When I activated it, I received one hell of a shock. What I had perceived as just a week or two was over a month. This also explained another aspect I didn't list, mainly because I thought it was something else. After each of these changes, I went to relieve myself, and it would be painful, like acid burning fresh skin. It wasn't that I had an infection, but instead it was for me not taking a leak in days, and I was running very acidic urine out. Just ouch. I took a big sigh of relief, since I wouldn't have to be on the lookout for penicillin anymore. And it was strange that after another hearty meal, I didn't feel the urge to sleep. Instead, it was time to hunt. Starting with the inventory, I had to make sure I had enough materials for the game that was this big. So, what did I have at my disposal? There was the shotgun from the dead guy, 2 claymore mines, a handful of grenades, the 500 Win Mag, 2 insect swords, and of course me with all my newly accounted appendages. In truth, it wasn't a lot, though it would have to be enough. First, it was time to see if my target was still there, or where it had been. Looking out the window, I could see that big hump was still in the pond. I would have to make sure that it was still alive to get it out. The damn thing was far too large for me to pull it out of there, so I would have to make it leave. Slowly, I made my way down around the watering hole. I was being very cautious, since I had seen what this thing could do to anything within reach. I got close enough to reach out my hand and touch the water. I gently grazed my hand across the water as I watched the massive hump in the middle. When it didn't move, I dipped my hand in as though I was getting a drink out of the pond. It wasn't until the waves hit the shell that it began to move. It moved so slow that if you were not watching, you probably wouldn't even notice. I saw it begin to rotate and saw it start to move a little bit closer. Immediately I pulled back and studied the way it moved. It was difficult to see at first, but I was able to tell which way it was facing by the subtle changes in the shape of the shell. With this, I had all the intel I would need to get things moving. That night, I set up the Claymore mine so that I could take this thing out without having to go in and get it. It must have slept at night because it didn't even flinch at me moving around. Screwing in and the blasting caps, I remembered how much I hated working with these damn things. I know people will think I'm being a bit of a pussy, but I just don't like working with explosives. They make me nervous. Once that was set up, I got a few long sticks and set them up near the edge. This would be my bait for the prey. Once that was done, I wanted to see if these new appendages were worth anything. Climbing up to the top of the buildings, I knew that if I failed, I could still handle the landing. I stretched my wings out as far as I could. This was kind of a little painful, like stretching a muscle you haven't stretched in a long, long time. But I did get it in position. Getting a little bit of a running start, I ran on all fours and jumped off, reaching out in front of me like all those comics. I tried to keep my wings out. I say tried because it was like lifting heavy weights when you haven't lifted in a long time. Doable, but rather painful. I knew I would be feeling it later. I dropped in altitude and thought for sure I was going to hit the ground rather hard when I suddenly leveled off. Keeping my wings out, I seemed to glide through the air with minimal effort. The wind blew past me, and I felt a sudden euphoria of leaving the ground behind and a new level of freedom. For a few moments, I felt nothing but free, and at that moment, nothing could touch me. Nothing except maybe the grove of trees I was coming up to rapidly. Not knowing how to turn, I ended up having to fold in my wings and crashing into said grove of trees. Desperately, I reached out for something to stop my fall, but with every newly introduced branch, I began to tumble. With each new trunk became another reason to spin out of control. With each new leaf in the face came another blocking of my view as I headed to the ground, landing with a solid thump as I performed a quick assessment, and with nothing actually broken, it was time to head back. This took a while because even though nothing was broken, everything hurt. Getting back just would take some time. The next morning, I began making myself a good breakfast. Afterwards, I put on my insect armor, even though I doubted it would help me any, and quickly found that the piece I used for my back just wouldn't fit anymore, thanks to my wings. It would take a couple hours to make adjustments so that I could use it. I got it to fit, but not all too well. I then made a makeshift holster for my pistol and loaded the shotgun. After putting the insect blade into their sheaths, I gathered the grenades. I took a deep breath and really wished I could have a drink right about now. Heading out to the pond, I began by moving the branches. This would simulate something coming to get a drink. As that big bastard began to move into place, I pulled out the grenades and tossed it behind the giant mound. I dropped to the ground just in case it went off before entering the water, and it detonated less than a second after the splash. As the plume of white water came back, the giant hump moved much faster towards the shore, straight towards me. Quickly, I tossed another one, and the resulting explosion got it right next to the shore. This time, I lobbed two at its backside, and it got it out of the water, and boy, did that work. With a burst of speed, this monstrosity raised its body out of the water and howled and cried as its head breached the surface. Then the legs came. The spindly, segmented, disgusting insect-type legs that pulled its main body out of the water. I tossed another grenade, and it squealed again as the explosion went off right behind it. Once out of the water, I got a very good look at it. The body was very similar to that of a tortoise with a huge shell and a head that looked like a snapping turtle. The legs were nothing like a turtle though, or any reptile for that matter. They were a thick insect-type legs, some that represented a tarantula without hair. I looked behind it and found out why it screamed. The explosions from the grenades had blown its tail open and part of it off, and a stream of blood was pouring out of it as it desperately climbed its way to shore. Pulling up the shotgun, I aimed for its neck. Even at my size, the recoil was enough to make me stumble a little, though not enough to get me through its neck. The buckshot simply bounced off its hide and got its attention. Even after pumping 3 more shots at it, there was no penetration at all. All I could think was, oh shit, as it turned and faced me. It seemed to realize I was the one that hurt it and began to charge. With those 6 insect-style legs, it was surprisingly mobile. It began to charge as it reached down for the first clacker. As I squeezed it, I could feel it click, and then the massive explosion. The claymore had detonated under the right chest with even more force to nearly sever the closest leg. It cried out in pain again as it thrashed for a minute as it seemed to be trying to catch its balance. It suddenly began to come at me with a new, renewed rage as it charged again with some incredible speed. It either didn't see or didn't care that it was running over the second claymore. This time, it hit the center of the chest with enough force to pick it up off the ground. My ears rung with the concussion from it, but that didn't even slow the thing down. It dove at me, trying to get me with its jaws. In desperation, I jumped back and used my wings to further propel me away from its snapping jaws from this horrible, horrible thing. I didn't even think about using my wings. It was just instinct. Great. Even with this, I could feel the giant bear trap that it calls a mouth brush against my armor. Rolling away, I lost my grip on the shotgun as if it was helping me anyway. In desperation, I reached into my haversack and pulled the last grenade I had. Struggling with the safety on it, I backed up as the thing was now beginning to get within striking range again, and it knew it. I got the pin out, but I knew I had to get it right this time. As it opens its mouth, I knew it was going to reach out its long neck to strike. As it did, I pushed the grenade forward as I jumped back again. My brain must have been working overtime because I realized it in mid-air. The grenade seemed to float as the massive beak chomped around it, making a horrible snap as it did. The neck reacted as it continued to move forward. If it tried again, it would catch me for sure. Just as I think I am so very dead, the grenade exploded inside the creature's neck. It must have been in the process of swallowing it when it blew. With that, the fight was completely taken from it. It was gasping for air and clearly began to choke on its own blood. I got back to my feet and drew the 500. Walking around to the side of the head, I could see that the shrapnel had torn holes all around the neck. I found one on the dorsal side, close to the back of its skull. I put the muzzle as deep in as I could and adjusted the angle. Cocking the hammer back, I said, "You are one tough motherfucker," right before squeezing the trigger. With that, I sent a bullet clean through its brainstem and the entire body slumped. Well, okay, now for the hard part, I thought. I would have to work fast from here. Every creature within 10 miles would have heard all the noise I just made. I might, and stress the might part, have 10 minutes. With the angle it was at, I was able to get it into position to flip it over onto its back. If I could have grinned, I would have once I saw the underbelly. Like a snapping turtle, it had very little armor underneath. This would make opening this thing a whole lot easier. The bug blades worked well, but they were no use against any of the carapace portions. Opening up the chest, I was put back by the amount of damage the claymores had actually done. The lungs were perforated. Guess those were actual gills on the neck? I couldn't tell, nor did I care at this point. Then, why didn't the shotgun work, though, I thought. I didn't think I had time to think about it, but I only had time to dress this thing out, and not clean like either. The heart, which I was looking forward to, was a lost cause. The second claymore had blown open at least 2 chambers, even though it looked like there was at least 8 of them. Even if it had gotten to me, the claymore had done its job when it went off. I was thankful that the massive liver was still there. I took that and the kidneys and nearly broke my haversack with the weight. Since there was no way of taking those insect legs, I focused on the meat from the abdomen to the legs. I probably lost more meat than I had planned to during my cleaning of this thing, but the little creatures were already starting to scurry about. I didn't have time to be choosy. So the abdominal muscles, back straps, or tenderloins, along with everything attached to the pelvis, was thrown over my shoulder and I just ran. I didn't have time to cover my tracks as I could hear calls from much larger creatures heading my way. Once I got to the building, it took some major work to get my prize and my new winged body inside my lair. Making sure to block the entrance, I had to look outside as I could start to hear all sorts of noises. At the remains, the feeding frenzy had begun. Groups of creatures began to emerge from the woodline as they all screamed in dominance at each other in an attempt to scare others away for the prize. I had to chuckle a little as I could see the kitty cats had already gotten to it, and I had taken several pieces for themselves. In a streak of speed, they darted off to leave the rest to fight over the carcass. The standoff was intense, as over a dozen of those mantis things stepped up, raising their forelimbs ready to strike. On one side was these strange, piggish human hybrids, while the other group seemed to be like canines, which began to growl and bark. It wasn't until after the cats ran off that the three sides seemed to say, "Let's dance," and they all seemed to charge in at the carcass. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I would have thought I was watching some weird CGI movie scene. Bodies were spun, flipped, slices bit, thrown, or torn as they all fought for their meal. Other smaller creatures used this as an opening to grab pieces of the carcass and take off before they got caught. There was at least one creature, about the size of a medium dog, that looked like it would mix between a dog and a cat and with nearly a scorpion-like tail and front claws. As it immediately dined on the large carcass, one of the mantis-type creatures began to slice at it. The dog thing held its own for a moment before another mantis drove its foreleg through the dog thing's back, locking it to the ground. This would have been totally badass, but it didn't see the pig creature running up at it and diving. It reached up and grabbed the mantis by the head and, with incredible force, ripped the head clean off. All in all, it was not a win for any side. The losses were far too great, and it just turned into survivors side by side eating what they could and then dragging their fallen away. I had to figure they would leave any food behind, especially looking at the hollowed out husk of the turtle thing I had taken out. With that, I headed down to take care of the big creature, at least what's left of it that I got away. It was a pretty hefty haul, if I do say so myself. Even with my increased strength, it was difficult for me to carry this much. I guess I still have adrenaline in my body at least. At least I know that's how I got it back. As I began to cut it up, I realized something. I wouldn't be able to preserve this, at least not how I've been doing. At this point, I had been drying the catch over or near the fire. Though with so many different creatures in this area, it would be a really bad idea to cook any food right now. The thought of eating the flesh raw turned my stomach a little as I looked over things. Now, there were some techniques I could use besides drying, but I could actually dry the meat without actually cooking it. Searching through the entire area, I began to collect all the salt I could find. Using a few sealable containers, I began to process the abdominal muscles and the tenderloin pieces. It seemed a shame to salt cure tenderloin, but simply wasting it was not an option. It took me into the night to get even halfway through processing. Like I said, it was a lot. Thankfully, my lunch was that massive liver. I still didn't know why, but raw liver is just so good I can't help but drool every time I think about it. Probably has to do with the high nutrient content, but that was just a guess. When I ran out of salt, I still had a lot of food left over. The pieces of the thigh were cut into thin strips and basically smoked. Thankfully, cold smoke doesn't carry the smell of the meat very far and all. Of course, when smoking meat, the smoke is supposed to be almost the same temperature as the surrounding area. While doing this, I had to toss the spider-type legs. Even smelling them was enough to make me want to retch. It smelled even worse than that mantis tasted. Ugh. What was left was something I was not really expecting to eat. Though I know they're very nutritious, some of this would just have to be cooked to avoid the gross out factor in prey flight. Getting some oil in the largest pans I could find, I knew I would be enjoying the biggest Rocky Mountain oysters this side of the Atlantic. I was grateful that the oil covered up most of the smell. The other piece that works in conjunction with the oysters would have to be eaten as is. I didn't have much oil remaining and there was no other way to preserve it without cooking it, though it could wait. When I went out to get the oysters out of the pans, I found out that I cooked them all the way through. Oh, thank God. Though breaded and fried, making them look like nothing like they had started, I was not looking forward to it. What made it worse is that I burned my hands getting them out, and hot oil splashed up at me. I almost dropped the oil all over the ground and screamed in pain, but I knew a lot of noise could ruin my night really, really fast. So letting them cool off, I decided to cool off myself. I worked my way up to the roof and wanted to try flying again. Now that I didn't have a massive predator to look out for, it would just need to look out for any smaller ones. No better way to do that than from the skies. I crept up and surveilled the area at first. I didn't need anyone else seeing me as I took off. I didn't see any movement on the ground, in the trees, or the air. I worried a little before making a run because I could smell the smoke from my fire, though I couldn't smell the meat, so little bonuses, I guess? I got a running start on all fours and jumped, extending my wings all the way out, and found it much easier to hold them out this time. I was very unstable until I realized that my arms and legs were lashing out. A side effect from never flying was that my appendages kept reaching out to grab onto anything to stabilize me, as though I had the sensation of falling. When I figured this out, I tucked my arms under me and pushed my legs back, kind of like I used to be when I was scuba diving, and this stabilized me almost instantly. I found it difficult to flap my wings to gain any type of altitude, but a few more flights should build up the muscle, I figured. For the most part, I gained altitude just by catching a breeze and circled a bit. Once I got my balance making turns, this was much easier. At least this time I wouldn't crash into that damn tree. In the distance, I could see the glow of a fire. I had time, of course, so I glided over to see who or what was there. To my shock, the pig things were sitting around it. When I went in for a closer look, a sudden downdraft forced me into the trees. So much for not crashing again, ka-thunk. The pig things immediately stopped what they were doing and looked around. Shockingly, a few flashlights turned on and were coming in my direction. I gripped the tree with my claws and retracted my wings and wrapped my tail around the trunk. All I could do was sit there and wait. The lights kept getting closer as I could hear noises and snorts getting closer and closer. The lights began to flip past me as they began to check the trees. I may have been pretty high up, but this was no pine tree. One good look, and I was dead. The lights brushed past me again. My heart skipped a beat when they did. A few moments later, I saw the lights go past my tail, and at this point, I was holding my breath. All I could hear was my heart beating in my ears, and I suddenly heard one of them call to the others. I couldn't make out much, but I did hear something about deadfall, whatever the hell that means. When they left, I watched them go back to their fires. It looked like they were eating something, but I had to get a better angle. I could hear tearing flesh and a pop from the fire, and the crack of bones, but no one was talking. I guess when your entrance is anything but subtle, others can be on edge for just a bit. Just as I climbed halfway down the tree, I could see what they were eating. Sometimes I hate being right. It was their fallen from the battle, along with parts of several other creatures. I had to hold my lunch down as I saw one of them pick up a pig-ish head, fresh from the fire, and bite into its jaw and take it clean off. That was it for me. I made my way back down the tree, and silently and very slowly, I crept back to the apartments. Once in the open area, I bolted to the nearest building and scaled it. From there, it was a few jumps to my building where my meal was still warm. After that much excitement, I just wanted to eat and go to sleep. The meal wasn't bad. In fact, the fried balls turned out to be really good. However, I still had to try and not taste the giant turtle penis that was my main course, but beggars can't be choosers. All in all, it was a very large meal, and I know sleep was not going to be far behind. I had gotten better at sealing up the place and silently so that the fire could go all night and I wouldn't have to worry about any unwanted guests. Though the truth of it was, since the pig things were cooking over an open fire, they would be the ones most likely to be visited. Once closed up, I could feel my eyes starting to get heavy. I took off my armor and decided to throw a few more blankets down to make the beds and push them together to make them even softer. After all the excitement in one day, I just wanted some good, solid sleep. That night was the first time I dreamed since this entire craziness began. It was strange. I mean, I've always lucid dreamed, but this was on an entirely new level. It was truly like living in some crazy situation. Yes, even crazier than the one that was going on around me. I could see my scaled skin morph and change color. I could fly at speeds so fast that my mind couldn't even keep up. I was fighting the turtle again, but this time with just the insect blades that couldn't cut, and even saw the cats fighting with the pigs as they fought different insectoids while the canine creatures cheered in the black and other flying creatures filled up the skies. That seemed to go on for hours when suddenly I could see my ex-girlfriend. The one that had got away type thing since I had moved for work. She was in my arms again, and at that moment I felt peace. A peace that I had only found 2 or 3 times in my life. Holding her in my original form, my original human form, while she slept on my chest. I moved my hand down her body and then back up to the tattoo on her shoulder. I wanted that moment to last forever as I bent in to kiss her. Then I heard something crash. Something large and unmistakable. It was the sound of 3 flat-screen TVs and a mirror falling to the ground. Someone was trying to get in. I didn't want to leave my piece. I wanted to stay there, but I forced myself awake. The weight of my eyelids was like somebody had superglued them shut an hour ago. I didn't even have both of my eyes open as I grabbed the 500 Win Mag with my left hand and stumbled to the doorway. As I fell down, I could see one of the insect blades, so I grabbed it with my right hand. Still drowsy to the point of feeling completely hammered drunk, I jumped down the stairs and swung my pistol towards the fire pit. What I saw was not what I expected to see.